Welcome, everyone, once again as we return to the art of everywhere else. Once again, I'll be your lecturer, Associate Professor Sam Bowker, and I am simply now giving you an opportunity to log in correctly as intended, because we are doing something very special tonight. As you might know, all of our presentations for the art of everywhere else, our shared events, our collaborative evenings together, or afternoons, depending on where you are in the world, they are all recorded for the benefit of my enrolled students in the subject Art 241 Global Art Histories at Charles Sturt University. However, because tonight is special, we have introduced daylight savings, which affects us in New South Wales and maybe also Victoria and Tasmania, but it does not include Queensland. So our poor friends who wear the maroon further north than us will be able to join in either by adjusting your schedules, as I hope maybe you have tonight, or by listening to the recordings as well. This evening, I will make the recording of this lecture available for everyone who wishes to join in at another time because of the daylight savings time difference, which last year caught quite a lot of people off guard. So if we are joining us tonight in real time, fabulous to see you. And if you're joining us by the recording, what an honor it is to see you at a time of your choosing as well. So now we've covered that little preamble to allow for the fact that some of us might be joining at a different time tonight. I'll be mentioning it again at the end of the lecture, but the key things I want you to have right now in your hands somewhere nearby are the scholar's treasures if you happen to be enrolled in this class. I would like you to have somewhere nearby your ink, your paper, your whetstone for grinding ink, and of course your calligraphy brush, should you happen to have one at hand. Because tonight we travel to East Asia. We will be studying the art of Japan, Korea, and China. And in doing these in this order, we will be focusing upon a wide range of practices which borrow and draw from each other across languages and regions and across thousands of years of history. So let's move into the two things that I know we need beyond the scholar's treasures. First of all, a map. This is what I mean when I say we are looking at East Asia tonight. We will be studying, of course, Japan, China, Korea, both North and South. Although in this lecture I have not specifically mentioned North Korea anywhere. Students, if you wish to include North Korea in your sketchbook, good luck to you. See what you can find. Other options, of course, include Mongolia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And from here, I am sure you will have no shortage of things to discuss, to focus on your themes. And I remind all enrolled students that the discussion of your preferred works on the discussion forum is extremely important because it helps us to choose the most appropriate inclusions for your sketchbook to build on your theme. If you haven't yet posted to the discussion forum recently, before you submit the second half of the sketchbook, I strongly urge you to do so. It can mean the difference between passing and failing in some cases. But the map is useful. The overview for the discussion forum is good. What do we really need? A ship. And maybe later on a banana for scale. This is the most auspicious ship I could possibly find for us tonight. This would be well known to anyone who's experienced the practices and rituals of a Lunar New Year in China, Japan, Vietnam, etc. It is called the Tarakabune. And the Tarakabune is basically the treasure ship of the immortals. It is widely referenced as a motif that celebrates the auspicious New Year in Chinese, Japanese, Korean culture and others in the region, but is quite a crowded ship. You'll see that we'll have to find somewhere to squeeze ourselves in, maybe sitting on that pile of gold ingots at the back underneath the auspicious branches of the pine tree, far away from the Chinese dragon's head at the other end. Of course, these are generally good dragons in this context. We have above us in the sky the crane flying overhead, another symbol of longevity and fertility amongst other things. And in the far distance behind those pine trees, that iconic volcanic rising of Mount Fuji, one of the most important of all the symbols in Japanese art, and a recurring cameo presence of the landscape of the islands of this region. But amongst that crowded ship, we are seeing a jostling gathering of immortal and lucky gods who each carry treasures. One of the reasons why the Tarakabune is invoked on the beginning of a new year is the hope that this ship would visit you or your house or your dreams. And you might be able to borrow or own one of these extraordinary treasures. So I would like you to choose from this ship, which one of these things would you like if you could have access to it? The hat of invisibility, rolls of brocade for the quilt makers out there, the inexhaustible purse, the scrolls of books of wisdom and life, or a magic mallet, or of course the robe of fairy feathers, or the bag of fortune. I like to consider the perhaps cursed alternatives to these, such as the inexhaustible purse, which simply has a hole on the bottom, or the keys to the warehouse of the gods, but you don't know where the warehouse is. Either way, we are considering this as our vessel through which we journey, loaded with symbolism, loaded with good luck and good fortune, and covered with individuals and ideas from many different origins across this region. The person who made this is also of interest to us, Utagawa Hiyoshige. Hiyoshige is one of the key Japanese printmakers of the ukiyo-e print movement, known to some as the floating world, and of course floating on a vessel to help us remember this. The ukiyo-e prints were a methodology of creating woodblock prints. So the drawing was made on a piece of wood, carved away to create one layer of color, which is stamped on a block of wood, or block of paper, pardon me, the sheet of paper. Then, respectively, the woodblock was reduced further and further to show less and less area for the ink to hold. Each stamp was successfully printed upon the paper, resulting in a colored, multi-layered work which was destroyed by its own creation. The woodblock print could not be reused once the color was changing because, of course, it was carved back each time. So it's a complex process that ensures a limited edition of work, but it made things like currency more affordable as a mass production system. And in this multicolored form of art, it made the work of an artist reproducible and therefore more affordable, and therefore could be sold more times to a wider audience. Japanese printmaking was widespread and there were many master printmakers. But two in particular stand out from our perspective outside Japan, Hiyoshige and Hokusai. Hiyoshige was about 35 years younger and much less of a bohemian than Hokusai. Hokusai gave us this great wave off Kanagawa, where we can see fishermen's ships like long rafts with outriggers are being pummeled by this extraordinary beast of an ocean, which is rising high over those tiny ships with clawed hands, as it were, each one curled like a tiger's foot, reaching aggressively for the ground, which of course will never remain steady for these vessels. So I think it's much better that we're in the first ship than the second ship. Now, you can also see at the distance a similar shape to one of these rising, arcing waves, but it is in fact Mount Fuji, one reminder of home, one orientation for us to escape these waves to a place of great constancy and assuredness, a national symbol of Japan and a powerful symbol of land against other elements. What we are seeing here is one of the most famous images in art history, full stop. Not just of Japan, not just of printmaking, but of humanity's representations of things we have valued over time. It is a striking story, a fearful adventure, but it is also something made from relatively simple elements and one of the most important things we have, which is the open ocean. It was part of a series of views, however. 36 views of Mount Fuji and other variations of these gave Japanese artists a way of selling editions of prints as something like an unbound book, a series of works that could be viewed in any given order or displayed seasonally or in other ways. Often these works invoked seasonality in different regions, and they were revisited in different sequences. Here we can see a lesser known Hokusai Great Wave with the very same title, The Great Wave of Kanagawa. But this was a different sequence, and we can see that some of the ideas are perhaps differently resolved. The water has more of a suction towards the ground or the lower levels, We have trees arising, interrupting the scene with a green and an almost golden hour haze of the sky. We see seabirds moving amongst the foam, and the claw-like hands of the wave, the tiger claws, seem far less ferocious and more confused in their chaotic tenacity. So here we are seeing the idea and the reminder that any one artwork exists at a stage in an artist's imagination, and there are versions before and versions after. The one we call definitive may not necessarily be the one the artist calls definitive. And once again, Hokusai's work did not have to focus on drama. Indeed, most of his work does not, which is why the Great Wave stands out so clearly if you're studying his body of work. What we are seeing here is another variation on these, a much simpler woodblock print in tones of white and indigo blues, a bit like what I'm wearing tonight. But what we are seeing in this is the fisherman and his partner or daughter interacting with, again, the ocean. There's still tenuousness, there's still fragility, but a solid rock is rising above those waves, and in the far distance, Mount Fuji, like a celestial visitor, emerges in its own plane of printing, separate from the block below. It all would have been made with one wood block carved repeatedly, but the scene here is coherent and contributed to as well by the arrival of calligraphy in two distinct forms. Each of these would be the work of a carved wood block, but here one resembles a block print calligraphy in the shared box, and the other feels like an annotation added freehand by the artist in the style of a painting, remembering that all of these block print images were indebted to a precursor tradition in ink wash painting, as we see here. And of course, I've chosen this because the images have a certain poetry between them, where one scene evokes another visually and compositionally. However, in these interactions, we are seeing a very deliberate mode of painting that engages with poetry. These were called shikajiku, which were the poem and painting scrolls in Japanese. Ink wash painting as a mode was widely used for both poetry and depictions of landscape or portraits or significant historical events or playful fantasy concoctions. What we are seeing here had, of course, different names that are similar across these languages in terms of the reference for the word for ink as a shared and very ancient word in this region, shu and shui. What we are seeing here as well in Georgetsu's work, he was a Chinese individual originally who became very much a master artist in Japan, where he was celebrated as having basically introduced Chinese forms of ink wash painting to Japanese courtly traditions. Here, his painting Catching Catfish with a Gourd, a kind of dried, hollowed pumpkin-like thing, is actually a Zen riddle. The idea being that catching a catfish is difficult at best of times because they're so slippery with sharp spikes behind their gills. But a gourd seems to be the least competent instrument to do this. A net would surely be more efficient, or some kind of spear perhaps. But the catching a catfish with a gourd is a philosophical puzzle. How does one do this? How does one entertain the impossible in one's imagination, if not in reality? Another element of this, the idea of the impossible in reality of non-imagination, was to create an ancient tree in one's lifetime. The art of bonsai, known in China, perhaps its precursor art form, penjing. But also penjing is a bit different to bonsai. Bonsai focuses on an individual or shared partnering of trees held and controlled in an almost domesticated fashion within a small ceramic vessel, which of course can be as much an artwork as the living plant within it. Penjing is more about the assembly of landscape, and within penjing we see the celebration of tiny sculptural details like temples, houses, fishermen, little human figures or fantasy elements, towers, pagodas, etc., pathways. Bonsai therefore focus on the cultivation of the plant as well as a cultivation of attitudes to time, to one's contribution in one's life, to patience, and to the admiration of what nature itself can achieve as perhaps the greatest of all artists. What we are seeing here is also a focusing on a kind of cultivation that might be in some ways alien or aesthetic to a Western idea of cultivation that looks at agriculture, for example. The idea that a fruit tree is valuable because it produces a certain amount of fruit at the right time of the year to enjoy it. These are about trees that have become venerable, like ancestors, or at least similar in appearance to them. And in this act of aesthetic veneration, we are choosing to focus on the form to become distorted and aged, or alive and healthy, but reminiscent of a life well lived, and arriving at the point when the plant is at its most interesting, not its most productive. But from here, I want to bring in a new element into this lecture based on comments from students last year. There was a reference to this lecture in the famous Australian meme regarding a succulent Chinese meal over which a man was allegedly arrested. This is perhaps the most succulent Chinese meal I can offer you in art history. We are looking now at the sculpture of naturally occurring stones which have been meticulously shaped and carved to resemble, in this case, a freshly washed bok choy in a jadeite stone, which is about nearly 2 feet high, and this extremely famous meat stone, reminiscent of a piece of carefully marinated pork belly with all the fat and the rind and the crackling ready to go. Braised pork, wonderful dish, allegedly invented by a Chinese poet exiled from the Song dynasty, but that's a different lecture. What we are seeing here is perhaps the most visited artwork in all of China. It is widely reproduced in restaurants and so on. It's only about 2 inches high, so banana for scale, quite small. But what we are seeing here, I need that person to leave the door alone, please, if someone can go away. Sorry about this. I'm being interrupted by a guest. I have to tell them to go away. 1 second. Here we go. Here we go. Please go away. Now, here we go. Okay, back to this now. Okay, sorry, the interruption of the recording. We're now here. Okay, back to this now. We have, I've just totally lost my train of thought, but we'll come back to this in a minute. Thank you all. We are now looking at this. Sorry, everyone. I really am sorry. That ruined the experience of everyone by having a segue disrupted by a visitor at the door unexpectedly, but we'll continue from here later. Rocks, rocks. That was my segue. Thank you all. Not pork, but rocks. I was thinking, where does pork go? Down the hatchet, I suppose. Rocks do not. What we are, oh, that was it, pork. Chinese pork industries, they reserve some 200,000 tons of pork in stockpiles kept by the Chinese government as an assuagement against wealth for the national sector in a way that we might consider currency or gold to be held as a national reserve. Now, what we are doing here is moving to another mode once again. Between bonsai and the sculpted stones, we have another act of veneration of the natural world, which is to identify stones sculpted without human hands. These are famously known as gongshi, and in a Japanese tradition, they're also called suisheki. But these forms are eroded limestone, which specifically evolve from high velocity rivers, creating elaborate and intricate forms by natural intention alone. They are arranged on stands quite similar to bonsai, and from here they adapt to become forms that are seen as cultivated scholarly virtues. Specifically, they evoke landscapes in miniature, very like penjing apparatus. But the curious thing about gongshi, which I'd like to share with everyone now, is just how big do you think this object is? If we're looking at this and scaling up in our minds to what we see as an ideal scale, whatever that might be, I might offer you this banana for scale, which is situating it as an object that could be potentially an ornament on one's desk, something no larger than a handful, or colossal in scale and working very specifically with the idea of monumentality, the mountain in miniature, arranged and positioned so the sun falls on it in the right way, changing across the day. So from here, we're also reminded of those 4 treasures of the scholar's desk, the elements that are essential for scholarship and the actions of erudite study: ink and inkstone, with which you grind the ink up, the brush to apply it as a calligrapher would, and of course the specialist papers, notably using mulberry leaf and other forms. These stones were part of an inspiration, and these treasures were often accompanied by the stone as the fifth treasure, perhaps the optional one. But of course, if you're studying the art of Chinese and Japanese and Korean scholars' desks, you may also encounter a widespread practice of still life painting known as Chongseku. Here we can see an action of the veneration of a scholar's stone, too large for one's desk, planted, as it were, in the garden, where it becomes a kind of artificial aspiration of nature, very like the bonsai principles. What we are seeing here is the interaction between the scholar respecting the stone and composing poetry in its honor. Again, using calligraphy, and some would say that the forms of the stone himself are also equally calligraphic. But they're also confusing. The idea of admiring a stone with no sculptural investment, only the ideas being invested into it, could be seen as a bit like a story of the emperor's new clothes. Nice rock. Where'd you get it? Is it art? No, I found it. This story is again evoked in Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite, which I mentioned just now as a very well-known recent film, where this stone, the Swisok in Korea, became quite an important element in the narrative, in part because it was gifted from a highly educated family to a more working class family who did not appreciate or understand its significance. And in so doing, this gift became a marker of class divisions between the two families in the film, and leading to quite significant changes at the end of the story. But suiseki perhaps do not belong indoors. Rocks don't need a roof in most cases. What we are seeing here is one of the most famous of the open-air dry gardens of the Ryoanji, which is a famous Zen garden in Japan. What we are seeing here are the esoteric principles of Zen as a philosophy, as an extraction from Buddhism with distinctive Japanese elements, which is personified here in an almost unreasonably unchanging garden. It aspires to a degree of permanence which seems unrealistic for most of us engaged in a continuously changing world. And of course, the scene around this walled garden does continuously change. The seasons, the weather, the time of day, the shadows being cast, the colors of the leaves, the blossom, they all change. But most important of all, so do the people. One of the intentions behind this seemingly perpetual garden of stone is that when a person enters, they enter it at a certain time in their life, whatever age that might be, and they are who they are in that moment. When they return to this place, however many years later, they will remember how they were in that previous visit, and everything that has changed in that time will become more meaningful. But something else too. Other interpretations have been applied to this site. It beckons interpretations. We are seeing here a reminiscence of the idea of islands in an archipelago. Some have compared it to a mother tiger and her cubs, with each stone being both selected and named and artificially positioned into this very precise arrangement as a Japanese garden. Other Japanese gardens can be found around the world. We have a famous one here in New South Wales up at Koa. But what we are seeing here is one in Canberra, a sculpture created by Fujoko Nakaya, the famous fog sculpture in the sculpture gardens of the National Gallery of Australia, one of its very first commissions as it opened. The actual infrastructure of the fog sculpture is not terribly exciting. It's a series of misty sprockets, I guess you might call them, whatever you wish to name these things in real term. I'm making up sprockets for them now. But the combination produces water exuded at high pressure. But water at high pressure is magic. It's fog, it's steam, it lifts through the air and moves gently with the breeze or hovers with the absence of wind, and it creates an otherworldly space where something that is sensory, cold and cool to the touch, something that obscures in the style of the ink wash paintings we saw at the beginning of this lecture, something that makes nature appreciated as an aesthetic thing. Not a coincidence, highly deliberate, but hiding much of that deliberation. Similar studies of nature can be seen in the photography work of Okuchiro Nakaya, who studied the formation of snow crystals. Indeed, as a designer, he was working with highly advanced photography systems and microscopes, and he was stationed unexpectedly at a research laboratory up in the Japanese mountains where it snowed for much of the year. And there he thought he had an opportunity to study how microscopic responses to ice form over time, and particularly how are snow crystals created in nature and thus could be created artificially, creating the right kind of snow for the right kind of purpose. And in doing this, he documented many, many, many snowflakes individually as photographs. You can imagine how difficult this would be to do. They have to be kept at the right temperature, photographed through a microscopic lens in a very limited amount of time. And in doing this, he published his findings, including the imperfect and the broken snowflakes, which differentiated his work from other American and European studies around his lifetime. But from the tiny and the subtle, the development of a single snowflake to something equally complex and far more horrifying. The 6th of August, 1945. At 8:15 a.m. I think you know what happened there, and I think you know where it happened. Here we are seeing the moments of the first atomic bomb tests at the Trinity site, where a Rabotronic photograph was taken by American scientists who you may have recently seen in the film, again, Oppenheimer, regarding these early experiments. Howard Edgerton's photograph was groundbreaking in its own technology of another groundbreaking technology, the development of a nuclear weapon, an atomic bomb, which at the time it was first detonated, scientists were not completely sure that it would not ignite the entire atmosphere of Earth. It was a huge and dangerous prospect. And of course, Japan remains the only place on Earth where nuclear weapons have been used in aggression and not simply as a threat. As a result of this, Japanese art and artists have responded to the idea of nuclear imagery and apocalypse imagery in quite specific ways. It remains a kind of post-traumatic stress which remains visible in their film, their literature, their plays, their poetry, and of course their visual arts. What we are seeing here is an artist perhaps very well known to many of us as an almost Disney-like entity, Hayao Miyazaki, a founder of Studio Ghibli. And his work focusing on hand-drawn animations are very well known to us through works like Spirited Away or Porco Rosso and other films like this. But this was a short film that was made in tandem with the film Nausicaa 30 years earlier. Giant god warrior appears in Tokyo, and it sets the scene for the story of Nausicaa, but it uses animation systems most unlike Studio Ghibli, live action puppetry and humans in costume. Akira is another setting where we are seeing nuclear-inspired imagery in Japanese contemporary visual culture. Akira is a story of a teenager with psychic capacities who is experimented upon in a laboratory, but really it's a coming-of-age story of individuals against authority systems. This anime started as a manga. It was a series of cartoon strips and graphic novels which became animated into a singular sequence of film. The film, therefore, was produced widely and then quoted for many given scenes, including sound design, by many subsequent anime artists and animators around the world. But of all of these forms, I think perhaps Godzilla is one of the most famous contributions of the Japanese to the global film industry. What we are seeing here, of course, is Gojira in Japanese, the very first human to wear the rubber mask and the suit to stampede upon Tokyo and other cities. But what I've shared with you now is something I'm very happy to have found. These three men are the first three actors to portray Godzilla. And I think that's just wonderful to have them in the same place, along with the quip, "That road must be enormous." Anyway, thank you all for entertaining that little dad joke with me. Similar elements here adapted from the idea of the giant fighting robot or humongous monster that towers over the skyline, known broadly as kaiju in popular culture today, using a Japanese word for the concept, in Neon Genesis Evangelion. Once again, Neon Genesis Evangelion is a TV series adapted from a graphic novel, and it draws upon many elements of Japanese culture, past and present, including forms of armor, forms of weaponry, the motifs and symbolism of elements drawn from Japanese history, with much more specific character dramas. In this case here, the young boy Shinji is growing up in a very high pressure environment with many adults wanting him to succeed against tremendous odds. Literally, the weight of the world is on his shoulders, as shown here in his portrait with his mum. And for those of us who have seen Neon Genesis Evangelion, his mum might not be the one you think it is in this picture. But let's move to something else. We're thinking now about contemporary Japanese visual culture in the arts. And here I'd like to bring us back to Australia with one extraordinary work in the Art Gallery New South Wales in Sydney. Takashi Murakami's work is usually of enormous scale. This is multiple meters wide, 10 meters wide, designed for the kind of warehouse that a Los Angeles-based art collector would store their billionaires' troves. So we are seeing work which is made on an almost unfathomably large scale in terms of collecting household objects, but it is made for the grand Q audience. What we are seeing is what he calls a super flat mode, indebted to Andy Warhol and pop art and things like this, the visual culture of manga and graphic novels and anime. But he's drawing upon elements of other Japanese cultures, here including the use of samurai with weapons and their long katana blades and others. We are seeing goblins or yokai and other oni or demons. We are also seeing a very important character, this large psychedelic cat, which is technically a maneki neko. Now, a maneki neko is one of these. I am holding up right now a waving golden cat that my sister very generously gave me for Christmas a few years ago. But it sits beckoning outside businesses as its waving hand brings people in with their fortune and their fathomless, bottomless purses. This particular entity, however, was one of the quoted sources from the previous work. Of course, in quoting historic forms of Japanese art, he is paying homage to his heritage and linking his work to a very rich past, visually and materially. For this is another very large woodblock print. Each piece is approximately 1.5 meters wide, and there's 3 of them together. So we are seeing a similar monumentality of scale, but each of these is a woodblock print, an ukiyo-e print, as shown at the beginning of the lecture. The face of the Oni stands completely gigantic and disconnected from a body, whilst the army of samurai are gathering around trying to work out what best way they can use to defeat this cat-like demon with its horned head. You may have noticed how intricate their textiles were on those pieces of armor. This is known as kumihimo braiding, and it is a very fine element of Japanese armor, remembering that these are made from lacquered and layered pieces of wood and steel held together with intricate embroideries. Each of these materials and craft modes offers an artist the ability to invest decisions and design into something that is more than functional. And in this case, the art of samurai cultures invoke the group to whom they are indebted or funded or otherwise affiliated. And in this case, this banner, this shashimono, is reflecting with a particular motto, mu, which is nothingness in Japanese language. These were, of course, very widespread and highly individualized, as each samurai was commissioned with their own armor that was made specifically to their measure. It wasn't simply stored in an armory to be recycled generically between people who knew how to wear it. And some of these, of course, become almost baroque in their complexity, where we see individuals with wild leaps of imagination, ostensibly so they're more easily visible in the field and they could issue orders and be seen by their men when they're fighting, but also in a sense for the sheer drama of display, that they could be recognized for iconic armor in a more courtly context away from the battlefield. This famous stag beetle styled armor, as evoked by both portraits in armor and the armor itself, also inspired the film Kubo and the Two Strings, where you might recognize a stag beetle character very similar to this. And it gets even more ridiculous when you move beyond the necessity of armor as protection and think about armor as fashion statement or personal rank. You end up with something like an avant-garde couture version of samurai helmet wear, where you see sculptures made for art's sake. The important element of this, however, is the sculptural components could be removed from the helmet so one could still fight in unjeopardizing gear, but the armor itself is still very playful in this sense. We have reminiscence of the fighting praying mantis with its large wings extended, not a dragonfly, although that's perfectly possible as well. And also, of course, those wonderful tenuous tendrils, the tentacles of the octopus. Now, in a previous year, I was challenged to include tentacles in this lecture, so we'll continue keeping them here because I wanted to share a different model of printmaking with you. We've mentioned ukiyo-e in the woodblock print. Would you believe me if I told you that an octopus could substitute for a woodblock if you need them to? They may not be as versatile, but this is a print made with an actual octopus, dipped and layered in just the right amount of ink, then placed on the right kind of mulberry paper and pressed very gently to create the image of the fish as it actually appears. Octopus count as fish for this purpose. Gyotako prints are thought to have evolved from fishmongers, where they were advertising their wares, and also from fishermen who were competitive with each other about the best catch of the day. And a print from the fish could both feed the printmaker, feed the fisherman, and prove that the fish had been caught in the way they described it. And this individual, Dwight Hang, still practices Gyotako printmaking in the USA, as he learned it from his Japanese ancestors. So here we see the truth of the matter. The print is actually the object and not simply reminiscent of it in the style of bonsai or suiseki. More octopuses because we just can't get enough calamari tonight. We are considering here two scenes by Kuniyoshi and Yoshitoshi regarding octopus in a more aggressive stance. Now, I share these with you because I am specifically not sharing with you The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife by Hokusai, which I'm afraid is just too R-rated for the art of everywhere else, despite it being almost as famous as The Great Wave of Kanagawa by the same artist. So these could be seen as studies for that much more provocative print, which is called a shunga or erotic Japanese woodblock print. But these are more aggressive stories set within a more fairy tale context. Usually the fisherman wins and something is discovered as a result of this conquest. But moving to much nicer things, we have finished with octopus, thank goodness for those of us who don't like slimy things with great brains in tentacled form. What we are seeing here are studies of Japanese fashion, in particular the woodblock print as a commentary running with satire and poetry and literary stories, but also evoking, in this case, a ghost story. I wonder if by now you've been able to find the ghost in these images, as we are seeing two quite completely different images here, but I position them so they're all reacting to the same point, this undead ghoul at the base of the scene on the right. What we are seeing here is therefore a celebratory fashion statement of the courtesans who are wearing these wonderful robes which are designed to be changed at different times of day and respond to the seasons, not just through their texture and their thickness for protection against the elements, but because the flowers are the right ones chosen for those times of year. As we can see here, the art of kimono is generally repetitive as far as the garment itself is concerned, but the textiles that compose this object are wildly variable, including silks and weaves, dyes of different forms, ikat dyes as well. And what we are seeing in this case is the outer layer of a kimono for a woman, some of which can be worn by men and women, or specifically for men. These particular forms are using a fabric that was made in France. But look at this carefully. We can see motifs of flowers and blossom with a repeating motif in indigo dyes, which is again very Japanese. It is so Japanese it was purchased in Japan and sold and recreated as kimono in Japan, but it's French. What we are seeing here is one of the impacts of Japonism, in which the forced reopening of an isolationist Japan, which refused to trade with the outside world, was enabled French collectors and artists in particular to engage in a very wide range of cultural appropriations, I suppose you could say, often homages in respect to the interest they had in this distinct art form, the visual culture of Japan and elsewhere, chinoiserie, Japonism, and other forms of this region. Here we can see a continuation of this interest in the work that we are finding now between this original robe with a sash in silk with wonderful embroideries of wisteria, again a very popular Japanese motif, cranes and other creatures in the reeds, and Obi-Wan Kenobi of Star Wars, which is heavily indebted to Japanese visual culture as studied from museum collections and woodblock prints from around the world. It is fiction, but it is fiction drawn from a source. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, the planet Tatooine was actually Tunisia in North Africa. But some things are too large to move in any other mode. What we are looking at now is the Daibutsu statue in the extraordinary temple palace Daibutsu Den. This is one of the world's largest extant wooden buildings, continuously used for a very similar purpose. The original structure dated back to almost 1,500 years ago. The current building dates from 1709 due to fires and other disruptions in the area. But rebuilding is something that is very important in Japanese culture. And as a result of this, we see sites like this. The Isejingu Grand Shrine in Mie Prefecture was actually the very first artwork that I wrote about for an undergraduate essay when I was studying art history at the Australian National University. There I was introduced to the concept of shikinen sengu, which is quite distinctively applied to this shrine and maybe a handful of others in other parts of the world around Japan and Korea. Shikinen sengu is a reference to a Shinto concept, the Japanese indigenous religions, where they focus on quality of tokowaka, or eternal youth, by replacement and repair. It's a bit like the ship of Theseus, that Greek tradition that this ship is the ship of Theseus, it's only been replaced several dozen times, so no part of it is real or the original ship of Theseus, but it's still the ship of Theseus. This temple is both 1,300 years old and no more than 20 years old. The idea being that every 20 years, every part of the structure is restored and rebuilt in order to keep these carpentry skills alive in the communities around the shrine. If you were to leave it built and intact and people didn't have these skills, then one fire could destroy it. And in the process of destroying that, you might lose the skills everywhere else in the community and not be able to rebuild. So in this principle, we're seeing quite a powerful ethos of design and repair, which is also very friendly for social media Instagram algorithms. This is Tetsuki, known as an extremely impressively, or for me at least, extremely impressive mode of craftsmanship. The cabinet maker's work of Japanese crafts include the adherence to not using nails where possible, because adding a nail to two different pieces of wood in an earthquake context could see the wood shatter, break, or bend as the nail splits and is rent asunder. Joining by complex, carefully crafted components creates a much more durable piece, which can also replace rotted or termite-infected components as needed, rather than completely repairing an entire structure. Other more complex works include the work of Yayoi Kusama, highly celebrated recently by the National Gallery of Victoria, where her infinity rooms attract huge crowds, similar to the crowds attracted by that pork sculpture we saw earlier. In Canberra, you can see one of these almost year-round. Her Spirit of the Pumpkins Descended into the Heavens is a carefully controlled mirrored room with this cube in the center surrounded by external mirrors. And on the inside, if you pop your head inside, you see this, an infinity of pumpkin gourds. Yasue Kusama was fascinated by the pumpkin as one of her spiritual motifs. She was also once upon a time a pornography editor who then moved into working art in full-time practice and checked herself into a mental health asylum because she found the residents to be more interesting and easier to get along with than some of her neighbors, amongst other things. But I recall as well that if you drop your glasses or your phone into this room, consider them lost forever. So they do, I think, take them out sometimes, but they don't open it during working hours to do that. Beyond the relatively static installations of Yayoi Kusama, we also see extraordinary real-time animations from TeamLab in Japan and elsewhere. And remember, Korea as well also has a great deal of innovation in digital technologies for contemporary art. What we are seeing here is artwork that responds to your movements as you move through this room. The water flows differently, the flowers open and close, other things change as you move through. They are truly responsive and very high-tech interactions on quite a spectacular scale. But these all have a precedent in Korean art, where people like Nam June Paik were especially well known for working with earlier analog film technologies. In this case, a television screen adapted with things like magnets or video cameras that cause relays onto screens in other rooms. Nam June Paik's experiments consider the television to be as versatile as a woodblock print. You were able to adapt, destroy, reuse the electronic components and circuitry of these televisions to create visual poetry of a type that no one else was making at the time, something that allows for chaos and control. And in this work, we see here in the work of the National Gallery in Sydney, the Maitreya sculpture of a form of Buddha representing itself, filmed watching itself in a kind of dialogue between past, present, and future, dematerialized and rematerialized from figurative form to virtual image. But of course, Nam June Paik collaborated extensively with many other people, including here Charlotte Moorman, who was an excellent cello player, and she performed on his TV cello while wearing TV glasses, all of which responded to contemporary technologies in the 1970s. There was a famous image of her playing on the TV cello while hovering from a hot air balloon near the Sydney Opera House. But here also we have Nam June Paik with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, who is also very much part of this story as a Japanese conceptual artist. But so is K-pop Demon Hunters, if we are thinking about impressive Korean things done on screen. You may have heard so much of this already if you have young people in the house who are enjoying the songs or simply participating in other ways. Honestly, it's a good film. But it references Korean culture in a number of different ways as a major cultural export. The idea of K-pop was brought to many people's attention outside of Korea with the rise of Gangnam Style, I think circa 2016 roughly. But K-pop Demon Hunters builds upon a huge industry within Korea of Korean language pop songs in a variety of genres. And here we're seeing collaborations between American animators, Korean animators, and the huge number of Korean animators working in Korea on a very wide variety of films, which celebrate, in this case, specifically Korean cultures. One widely cited reference here within this film is the subtle reference to minhwa, or Korean folk painting, referencing these two characters, the magpie and the tiger, which in the film were known as Sussy the magpie with 3 or 6 eyes technically, and Derpy the blue tiger. Wonderful names. I hear they'll be in the sequel. Good. But within this, the original Korean painting mode responds to the tiger as a figure of daft authority. So it is governance, it is the crown, it is the police, but it is also wildly incompetent. Whereas the magpie represents something of an everyday working class figure, which is able to subvert and outwit that which would try to control it. Like Collingwood. But on to another story from here. From Korean culture to the present, to the past. I wanted to share this as one of the most extraordinary products of the Korean scholarly tendency towards preservation of knowledge, here with the Tripitaka Koreana held at the Haesina Temple in South Korea. It consists of a huge number of wood blocks designed to reprint the Tripitaka, or the extensive Buddhist principles which are widespread across Korea and the region today. The wood blocks were designed to have extremely long-lasting permanency, and each block of birchwood here, as held in his hands in this picture, was cut, soaked with seawater for 3 years to prevent insects from eating it, boiled to prevent distortion, exposed to wind for 3 years to dry out any chance of remaining wood water that could cause rot, carved only then with text, coated in a poisonous lacquer to deter any future insect problems, and then framed in metal to prevent warping. There are thousands of these blocks, and collectively they represent one of the longest lasting repositories of archive, which can still be used to print this book today. Remembering that the printed book, in woodblock form at least, predates European systems by a long way in Asia. Another Korean form, perhaps less well known but highly celebrated in Korea, are the ceramics of the moon jars. And I reference ceramics today with reference to our friend Jackie Tinkler in the Goat Gallery at Natamak. So you may be very familiar with moon jars. These were used to make things like kimchi or store rice or other food sources, or simply preserve items for safekeeping for a very long period. Moon jars tend to occupy a similar proportionality, but they're highly celebrated for qualities of wabi-sabi, which is a Japanese term, different term in Korea, which is the beauty of imperfections, letting the beauty be seen through the broken glass. And indeed, this reference to golden objects is no small reference. What we're seeing here is a borrowing of the broken form with a famous art practice known as kintsugi, which has again different names in different regions. Here it is celebrated as a form of golden repair, in which the act of healing together different pieces of ceramics was once meant to evoke the value given to a repaired thing rather than replacement. It now stands as a different philosophical statement in which artists are adapting kintsugi to create new and original sculptural forms. Here, as seen from the work of Yi So-kyun and others. However, the act of breaking is itself an art statement for some. This is one of China's most controversial artists at the present day, Ai Weiwei, who is currently living in Portugal with a second home in Cambridge, having been imprisoned by the Chinese authorities previously for tax evasion and other subversive actions, and is now celebrated on the International Biennale circuit as one of China's most high-profile artists. In his earlier career, he came to fame for a variety of provocative actions, one of which was these series of photographs dropping a Han Dynasty urn, over 1,000 years old, an archaeological object that has survived intact to the present day, and in his hands he lets go and lets it shatter on the ground. This series of photographs documents the performance of the work itself, but it remains a very provocative action. You can see that he's staring at us as if in defiance, as if, are we going to catch it? No, of course we're not. It was a response to the Chinese government's destruction of heritage sites, especially in older city centers, where entire blocks of once significant communities were demolished to create new skyscrapers, and the furious progress of modernity stood completely at alienating odds with the preservation of any kind of heritage. So here again, another Han Dynasty vase, an original ancient object, has been painted upon with the English language logo for Coca-Cola. Ai Weiwei is very much a humanist in his work. He responds to the working majority of individuals in China. He thinks about the way labor is valued or not valued in the arts, and he collaborates with craftspeople to make large-scale works. Here, his sunflower seeds were individually hand-painted ceramics, not one real sunflower amongst them, or copying the idea of a sunflower, which is of course a popular snack in China, but also refers to the poverty of individuals during the Cultural Revolution, when they were forced to eat sunflower seeds in lieu of any other kind of food on the Long March, in which so many people died. What we are seeing here is Ai Weiwei in Turbine Hall of the Tate Modern in London, holding thousands of those sunflower seeds, which are scattered across the ground, creating a huge beach which crunches underfoot. Every single one of those ceramics, remember, was handmade and piled up like so much wealth in rice. But in this collective form, many people also took individual handfuls home, and they're still gradually finding their way back to Tate Modern or other places. What we are seeing, therefore, is a commentary on the enormous industrial scale of contemporary China, the value of the handmade, and the idea of it being the first place in the world with a population of over 1 billion people. And yet there are other individuals who should be noted, perhaps at the opposite end of the art spectrum from the celebrated super celebrity of Ai Weiwei, who gets solos at the Tate Modern. What we are seeing here is the king of Kowloon, the graffiti artist Sang So Cho, who works on any surface he likes because it's graffiti. He doesn't get permission, doesn't need it, as it were. His work is a weird, ranting polemic, a series of words which are decipherable and legible, but in a quite a chaotic and cat-handed calligraphy which stands out as a distinctive handwriting in the very calligraphy-rich context of Hong Kong. But in this case, he's also adding elements which are somewhat his own mystical variations and visions. They're often the writings, as it were, of a mad person, but they are very persistent and they turn up in unexpected spaces to the extent where some of them have been preserved as the art of this individual and not painted over by council, so that at least some will remain for future generations. He's a highly regarded figure in some and hated by others. But on this continuation of calligraphy, I wanted to share with you two extremely impressive, for me at least, works by Zhu Bing. This is one of the works I saw when I was a high school student in Canberra, which led me to study art history as a profession. It is his book From the Sky, a series of Mandarin Chinese looking texts, which are all individual, hand carved as woodblock prints, like the ones we saw in the Triplicana Korea. However, anyone here who reads Mandarin will find this is totally illegible. It makes no sense, but it looks like it should be legible. It's a form of writing called asemic writing, not anti-Semitic writing. I'm saying asemic. It's a different word, A-S-E-M-I-C, asemic writing, which means it resembles text without carrying the meaning of text. And here his idea of a message, as it were, from the sky, given to us by the ancients, is completely and utterly impossible to decipher. Unlike this, Zhu Bing has given us here an introduction to square word calligraphy, which attempts to make Mandarin more legible to an English language audience. He's effectively writing English in something resembling Mandarin. And you might find this strange because you can see how individual letters might be evoked on this guide to one side. But on this combination text, like a piece of poetry, we do see poetry. The very top one on the top left corner, the word is little. It's an L with two T's, an I, an L, and an E underneath. Little. I hope you can now see the L-E in the first L. Beneath it, in that column, we have another word, just two letters, bow. Little bow, third word. Peep. Has lost her sheep, and you can read the rest from there. It is a most curious thing to find English reformatted in the ways that Mandarin is written, with individual structures that indicate different pronunciations and therefore different etymologies of language. But this is how it is read. So what we are seeing here is quite an audacious idea, writing English in a manner suitable for a Chinese vision, or Chinese in a manner suitable for an English vision. But one more curious movement. You might recognize this as the tower or the column with the symbol of St. Mark, the winged lion that stands over the Italian city of Venice. This itself is thought to have been a Chinese object made with copper from the Yangtze River valleys, and originally most likely being a guardian figure from a tomb or similar temple structure. They've removed the horns that were once extant, they've added wings and changed the feet, but the form itself is adapted from Chinese copper, as studied by recent metallurgical analysis. These guardian figures are a very well-known Chinese and Korean and Japanese element, sometimes called foo dogs, which is not quite accurate, but they're usually partnered and paired, one being male, one being female. The way we tell is to look at their claws. You can see here that one is slightly higher than the other, and it's holding a cub under its foot, playfully tickling it like a kitten. The other one, the male, would be seen holding its hand over a ball, which could variously be made of gold or suggested to be gold, or an embroidered cloth ball. Together they work to guard spaces as an auspicious figure and thwarting evil spirits from entering. But from one rolling metal to another, I think it's important that we recognize one of the most important images to emerge from China in recent years, that is to say my lifetime, the Tank Man photograph by Stuart Franklin near Beijing. We may all remember this as standing solidarity as a single figure whose name and identity has never been deduced. But I wonder how many of us have seen the rest of the scene that Stuart Franklin was watching from his hotel window. That's the full Tank Man sequence. Stuart Franklin, with other journalists, was asked to be moved from the room, forcibly moved from the room he was staying in his hotel that overlooked Tiananmen Square in 1989, and he was shunted off to the opposite side of the hotel, which gave him this view of the tanks preparing to roll in to quash this protest. No images of that aftermath have been released, but it has been described by many witnesses as a terrifying and awful ordeal, which led to, of course, many changes in Chinese art as individuals who were in support of these reforms that were advocated by this protest crowd chose to or took the opportunity to leave China when they could for their own political safety, including Bob Hawke's declaration at the time as Australian Prime Minister that the Chinese student visas could be extended to permanent residencies for those Chinese people studying in Australia at the time. One of those people was Shen Jiawei, who had actually been employed in China as an artist working on socialist realist propaganda images for the Chinese Communist government, the CC Communist Party. What we are seeing here are typical images of his kind of work before, but in Australia he's become very well known as a very well established portraitist collected by many institutions across the country. Here he's depicted with Judith Neilson, who is the advocate and collector responsible for Sydney's White Rabbit Gallery, which celebrates all forms of Chinese art, including forms that cannot easily be exhibited in China due to political censorship. And of course, in Australia, we see a number of other Chinese artists working closely with Australian art. Arzian, the ceramicist, creates portrait forms in cloisonné, which is a beautiful ceramic form that uses fine wires and differently colored glaze to create very complex surfaces. And I've always loved this portrait of John Yu, the children's surgeon in the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra, where I used to work. Many of us, if we don't get to see galleries and fine art collections in Australia, may be familiar with Chinese arts being celebrated on Instagram, TikTok, and other social media through videos of surprisingly serene countrysides where very hard-working individuals are preserving traditional craft and recipe practices. These have a number of different authors and different creators, and they might now be considered as a new frontier in Chinese art, a form of short filmmaking designed for social media. Some call them propaganda, some call them nostalgia. They're not necessarily politically overt in their messaging, but they do carry a kind of nostalgia and a veneration for complex processes which are at risk of being marginalized in a heavily mechanized world. From there, the last thing I'm going to share is the work of Zhang Zuodong with one of the most famous ongoing scrolls in Chinese art history, Along the River During the King Ming Festival. It's over 5 meters long. We're just seeing a tiny fraction of it here, but it is quoted many times by Chinese artists, and you're more likely to see this artwork on a Chinese restaurant menu in Australia than any other, part at least, of the King Ming Festival river scenes, which have been borrowed by more contemporary artists like Kai Jiao Guang as a celebration of gunpowder. Remember, this was invented famously in China. And here, the adaptation of fireworks to create meandering river maps inspired by the dragon or the rainbow serpent, here mapping the Brisbane River for the Queensland Art Gallery, or celebrating Cognac in France, where cognac barrels have been floated in the river and used to launch fireworks, each with tendrils reminiscent of a great wave at Hokusai and in extraordinary colors. Cao Guinyang thus, I think, ends this lecture on a fireworks note, because I know I'll be seeing fireworks in the emails from those of us who missed the beginning of this lecture because of daylight savings time. Yes, I'm talking to you, if that includes you, had you logged in just now. I hope you enjoy the recording of this lecture, which I will make available for all our audience members. Thank you all as we join next week for Oceania, a Third of the World, which is our last lecture in this series, which I will also record. And remember, it begins at 5 p.m. Queensland time, 6 p.m. New South Wales, Victoria, because of the daylight savings change. I will circulate the link to this recorded lecture after the lecture, and the link to the new Oceania lecture will also be shared in the same place. So thank you all. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through the art of East Asia, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the final in the art of everywhere else. Have a great night.